Hi everybody, thank you very much and for coming back after our morning coffee break. So we do have a panel right now hosted by Jeffery talking more about some of the topics we were talking about before the break in this room, South African cannabis, government, etc. I'll hand it over to John now.
Thanks very much and good morning everybody. This panel is entitled South Africa, Cannabis, Government and the Private Sector. So it's rather a wide topic. The only thing that's particularly clear is we're talking about South Africa, not about other countries, but I'm sure they may well come up in comparisons. You should have seen who's on the panel or looked up their bios. Myrtle, who was on the previous one, so she needs no introduction. Paul Michael Keichel, have I pronounced it right?
Close enough.
Okay, who is a attorney but working with Culligan's environmental, more of an environmental law firm, if I can put it that way. I hope that's correct. Hilton-Barber, who I assume should need no introduction for anyone who has read or reads Cannabiz news. And then Rochelle Nigrande, who's more on the side of the Section 22 and the SAPRA regulations, that kind of thing. And then I'm John, so none of those people are government. I used to be government. I'm not, would say not really anymore. So I was in the public sector and government for a number of years, 30 years as a public representative. Now I'm project manager of the Hemp and Cannabis Master Plan, which is a part-time position, meant to be 12 days a month. And it's working with government. Unfortunately, no longer part of government. It's been quite a big change where you could engage with officials and things would get attended to where you were literally knocking at the door with other people to get movement. But look, I don't want to speak for too long. This is meant to be a free-flowing conversation. But maybe just to start, that the situation we're in South Africa is we'd started providing for hemp from the late 2010s and for medical cannabis. For both of those, or cannabis for medical purposes, for both of those it's largely been decriminalization through regulation, not through statute. So basically, the old Plant Improvement Act of '76, which was used to make provision for hemp, doesn't talk about hemp at all. It was put into regulations, and that's then continued with the new Plant Improvement Act. The Medicines Act, it's been an issue of amending schedules, which the Minister of Health is able to do by regulation. So it's removing cannabis, putting THC on Schedule 6 and CBD on 0 and 4. So that side of things has been, and there's been movement, as you know, with the new Plant Improvement Act and the definition of hemp going up to 2% maximum of THC. Then you've had the Constitutional Court case, Ras Prince's case and Myrtle's, and that then made provision for using cannabis for private purposes in a private place. We could have a debate around, surely there are private places on university property, but that's another story. We're in the limbo of the Private Purposes Act has not come into effect yet because it's waiting for the regulations to be finalized. You heard a bit of that earlier from I think it was Josh contacting the Department of Justice, although the version of where the regulations are that I have is slightly different to what the officials were telling him. But anyway, we're in that limbo. That bill is, or that act is rather just about providing for implementing the Constitutional Court judgment. We can have a debate, Russ Prince, over whether it does comply or not, and that's the subject of your current application, or your Part B. But the legal position when it comes to private use would still be then the terms of the Constitutional Court order, which is not setting any amounts, not allowing any form of dealing, those kinds of things. So that's where we are. Government is embarking on a process of drafting an overarching cannabis bill. So work is now sort of properly underway with that, but it's still early stages. There are the issues of, because that process may take time because the issues are complicated, there are the issues of what other short-term amendments, statutory amendments should be put in place to try and regulate the cannabis retail sector, regulate the growing of cannabis. When I say cannabis, I'm using the government definition of over 2% THC. But so we're in a largely unregulated area. I always, maybe one last point, I always like saying that as South Africans, we love regulations. We can regulate ourselves to death, but we are not particularly good as South Africans of sticking to regulations. And I think when one is looking at regulating the hemp and cannabis sector, one's got to take that into account. There's been some reference to liquor, which I think generally everybody would agree is more dangerous than cannabis. But I'd seen a recent report in Gauteng that there were something like 200 liquor inspectors in Gauteng. I might have the figures not exact. And something like having to police 36,000 liquor outlets, which is obviously not possible. So we need, when we come to regulating cannabis, to look at what can be practically done and what should we be focusing on. But anyway, I want to let everything flow. It really depends on what people want to talk about. We've got an hour. So I'll give everybody just a few minutes to say what's burning on their chests or minds, and then we can let the conversation flow from there. I noticed with the first panel that there was a lot of audience participation. I hope there will be this time. So one would want to free up for that as well. So just going on the program, Myrtle, if you could just say a few words.
Thank you, John. I don't know what a few words are.
Say what's on your mind.
So what's on my mind is the good, the bad, and the ugly. If we had to celebrate what's happened in South Africa over the last 16 years, 20 years for my brother Gareth over there, I think if we look at the good, we are the first country in the whole world to legalize home growing first. And I think we can just give ourselves a round of applause. We also have, for what it's worth, the highest THC threshold for hemp in the whole world. So let's give ourselves a pat on the back for that. And we are also a nation of tried and tested hustlers. Because even my brother Paulo, where you are, I'm not sure if he's here. Anyway, my brother Paulo from Brazil, there he is, was saying to me, how does this happen? How does this happen? Look at all these shops. How does it happen? It can't happen like this in Brazil, you know? Brazil also have medical cannabis, and they are quite close to having their medical associations, which is sort of medicalized version of our cannabis private clubs. So now we have this amazing thing called cannabis private clubs, and so many people around the country, from the tiniest little dorps to the centers of Cape Town and Johannesburg, trying their absolute best to self-regulate, keep their establishments private, Go through the 3 pillars that Steve D'Angelo was talking about. Make sure that your products are tested, make sure that your products are labeled, and make sure that you're looking after your members and keeping the youth safe. So I think there are so many of us who have ticked all the boxes, yet cannabis private clubs still remain largely illegal in theory. But then on the other side, we've also got a hustle that is called Section 21. And this really, really hurts my heart, because what it amounts to is a lie to get high. And Amy over there walked into a club in Johannesburg the other day, and she called it their wall of integrity, of legitimacy. So they had a Section 21 permit, they had a letter from a lawyer, they had a Fields of Green certificate, which is not a license. It's not a license, just a code of conduct. And they had this one and that one and the other. But I think the biggest heartache at the moment with all the establishments around South Africa is this misuse of this Section 21. And as far as I'm concerned, it must stop, because that is a contravention of our human rights, that you lie to get high. I mean, there's even people that advertise saying, Section 21, no prescription needed, on the outside of the store front. So that's my big beef. I've got a little bit of a celebrations today. It's amazing to see anybody. But can we please deal with these Section 21s once and for all? Thanks.
Thanks, Myrtle. I'll actually not follow the program just because we have a rotating mic, so I'll give it to Rochelle to say what's on her mind. She might want to follow on from the Medicines Act, but that's up to her.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, John. Just to agree with what Myrtle says, Section 21, honestly, from a regulatory perspective, as much as the Act itself allows for that, I think we are looking more so for industry to at least engage with us and see how we can ensure the safety and efficacy of the product to the end user. I think it's quite important if we follow the regulations, like what John said. We are a country that has a lot of regulations, but at the end of the day, we need to utilize those regulations. It's quite important, as much as licensing is a tedious process. I think as stakeholders that engage with SAPRA on a daily basis, we are trying to push so hard that they can communicate with the rest of the industry, including traditional cultivators. They need to come to the party. There should be a way whereby we can all meet and sit at a round table like this, discuss on how we can ensure document control, we can ensure traceability of the product itself, because the goal for each and everyone sitting here is safety and efficacy of that very same product.
Thanks very much, Rochelle. Moving on then, Brett. I would say from where you are with Cannabis News that you're in the center of all information, or a lot of information flowing in, but tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks, John. Yes, I published Cannabis Africa, which is the sort of B2B news platform looking at policy and other developments in the industry. And I sort of a curious place somewhere between the private sector and government in terms of the communication matrix. And I want to make one observation to date, which is allied with the lack of clear regulations on the table. But actually, because there isn't clarity in terms of the rules of the game, it's very difficult for there to be clear communication as a result. I've gone out of my mind trying to get comment from SAPRA on straightforward things like how many cannabis patients there are in the country. And I've gone to the Department of Trade and Industry, to Justice, to small business to try and get a comment. But because there's no official line, everybody is reluctant to put their heads on the table and say, actually, this is what's happening, or that's what's happening. And so from government in many ways has been its own worst enemy in terms of not being able to clearly communicate what it's doing. And that's for an obvious reason, because with all respect, I don't think there is one song coming out of government. And I'd be quite curious, John, just as an aside, to get a bit more of your insight into the thinking of the Department of Justice, because they seem to be the government department that's holding everything back the most. And I agree with Russ Gareth about, why couldn't the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act be amended without having to go through the torturous path of the Cannabis Act? Could it not have been amended by the Department of Justice way back, as Gareth says, straight after the Court decision in 2018? So the one observation I'd like to make is from a communication perspective, government is handicapped until such time as there is a clear set of regulations, because you can't expect clarity from different departments if there is no directive. And the ad hocness is particularly evident amongst the police. I mean, the example of the Sea Point policing precinct is a completely different story or narrative to what's going on in Mitchell's Plain or Blue Downs or anywhere else. And then the communication from the private sector is also problematic because everybody is breaking the law. So in any normal sunrise sector, and as somebody said, cannabis retail is probably the retail growth story of the 21st century in South Africa. It's surpassed any other kind of economic activity in terms of going from nowhere to somewhere quite big to who knows how much money is being turned over in that sector, but it could be north of 40 billion rand a year. I saw some study put it on par with the Gauteng Tourism's annual budget. It's somewhere around there. And John, you've made the equivalent of, it's in that same zone as the sex work industry. It's this kind of unregulated but accepted area of economic activity. But the likes of a Bud Box, who's going to become the new Pick and Pay of cannabis retail, or the likes of that, they don't want any publicity at all because everybody knows that they're breaking the law. So to try and get advertising or kind of a genuine conversation going in the media is very difficult because the whole word legality is very, very loaded. And the private club sector, I made the mistake of saying somebody was legal, and did I get it in the ear? You might be compliant, but dear goodness, don't say the word legal around here because nobody is. And I think as long as this whole smoke and mirrors thing carries on and everybody pretends that it's legal, it's okay. But as soon as there's a set of regulations on the table, I think Myrtle, you're going to see all those Section 21s and Section 22C suddenly become exposed for being not compliant. I mean, they are serving the rec market, not the medical market. And I think it was the last thing I'd like to say, I think it was the sheriff of Kentucky who said, the mistake was made in a lot of places in the States was that they legalized medical before rec. And actually, adult use general legalization would be much easier to enforce, actually, and then develop a medical framework after that, because that would get the light get high crowd out the way and enable South Africa to really focus on the medical benefits of cannabis. So we're in a confusing situation, and it's going to carry on being confused for a lot longer. And also, when the regulations come in, if you look at the liquor industry or the tobacco industry, we might have a great set of compliant rules, but actually the black market in both those sectors is getting bigger, not smaller. And so what does that mean for the cannabis industry? I'm not sure. That's me.
Okay, thanks. Paul, Michael, your thoughts? Maybe you could also respond to some of Greg's points.
Yeah, thank you, JJ. I'm going to try to supplement instead of repeating, because I think we've already covered quite a lot of ground here. I sit in this unique position alongside Ricky. We've been at this for together about as long as cannabis law could be called a thing in this country. So we are approached by a wide spectrum of clients looking to engage in various different activities. And the fundamental thing about being an attorney is that you have to be honest and state the law as it is, not as you're not supposed to interpret it in order to serve your client's wishes, for that matter. And it's very, very frustrating because we keep getting approached saying, twofold, I'd like to do this, and then we say, all right, but that's technically illegal, and they say, but how is everybody else getting away with this? How is it that this is being done in the open air, and there are no consequences to that individual or to that business. And the answer to that is multifaceted. I mean, we are in this very frustrating situation where when Russ Gareth got his judgment alongside Myrtle, everybody thought that we were on the brink of something, that this continuing state of perpetual imminence was finally going to come to an end. We all anticipated at the time that the Private Purposes Act was going to be implemented within 2 years of that judgment. That didn't happen. I think we only saw a working draft after 4 or 5 years, I think it was. And what happened there is that all of the sort of, and please excuse my language, all of the sort of mavericks took the gap. They said, well, we've been waiting long enough, and we're just going to go ahead and do what we think is right in the circumstances, absent regulation, etc. And we're now in this sort of feedback loop where, yes, government can be legitimately criticized for having taken too long. But similarly, because of all of this maverick activity and blatantly unlawful activity, we've also got this situation where the government decision makers are being spooked. Because now this genie is out the bottle. We've got this thriving black market, for lack of a better term, or an illicit market, or whatever you want to call it. And all of the harms, well, not all of the harms, it's not like the sky has fallen, but we went to court not shying away from the fact that under certain circumstances, unregulated cannabis can be harmful. We didn't go to court calling for a free-for-all on cannabis, complete decriminalization. We said, on the basis of David Nutt's evidence, that a regulated market is the least harmful way of going about cannabis in any country. Now we've got this completely unregulated free-for-all, and government is faced with this position where we can't shove the genie back into the bottle. So we now have to have this situation. It's almost like a negotiated social contract where we say, all right, well, we want to put in place regulations, but how do we incentivize those people who are already thriving in the black market to move from the illicit space into the licit space? So one obviously cannot set the barriers to entry too high. One needs not to overly tax it. One needs to manage prices and these sorts of things. So it's a difficult one because the blame, as I said, rests on both government and the private sector. How to crack this nut effectively, well, we're going to see, time will tell. The one thing that I just wanted to comment on, it was in relation to JJ's opening remarks, is that yes, this interim space has sort of been solved so far through amendments to regulations as opposed to primary pieces of legislation. But we still operate in this space of legal absurdity. I don't say this lightly. The fact is, and the fact remains, that the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act only makes an exemption to the criminal prohibition on drug dealing in respect of holders of medicinal licenses. So there is actually no technically legal trade in hemp in this country, which is why we come full circle. And as you mentioned, there is some work being made to this overarching Cannabis Act. And that is necessary. And it's necessary so that everybody knows what the law is. Everybody can play by the same rules or elect not to play by the same rules. But then if you're electing not to play by the same rules, presuming that the rules are legitimate and respected by everybody, then you're going to have to face the consequences. And we can debate whether or not those should be criminal consequences or enforcement, civil enforcement by the cannabis ombudsman. But it's not an easy nut to crack, ultimately.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got a sense of what's on the panelists' minds. Maybe just a quick response to some extent to Brett. How did we get here from government side? So as I had said, even before the court application, work was being done in terms of trying to provide for cannabis for medical purposes and also for hemp. After the judgment, it was initially health that were leading on the issue. The then Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, had a advisory committee. There was meant to be a bill from Justice to comply with the Prince judgment at the same time as other legislation from either Department of Agriculture or Trade and Industry or both. Unfortunately, and health were actually doing, I think, quite well at that stage, but unfortunately then along came COVID in early 2020, and they got diverted into dealing with that, and agriculture then became the lead department. They then decided to tackle the hemp issue by using the old Plant Improvement Act and defining hemp as what was it, 0.2% THC. When the Private Purposes Act was introduced, and it was in 2021, so 3 years after the judgment, I remember the President complaining as to why is it only this bill, where's the regulatory provision? But we basically were already out of time with the Concord deadline. Look, I mean, they set 2 years, which is a bit of an odd phenomena because they had done a reading in, and that reading in becomes permanent if Parliament hasn't amended the Act, but Parliament can actually amend the Act at any time. So the status we're in is there's the reading in on the Drugs Act and the reading in on the Medicines Act, and then the legislation will come. But yeah, that's why it's been a bit dysfunctional, I think. I think one of the problems within government would be there would be different perceptions of cannabis and its dangers. So you're more likely from health to have concerns around the impact of cannabis and THC in particular. You're meant to have, as I think was mentioned on the earlier panel, Department of Social Development dealing with harm reduction, but they're also a little bit caught up with other things. But part of the problem is not a common understanding of the dangers of cannabis, not a common understanding, and you'll sometimes hear it from government officials, some government officials, no, cannabis is a gateway drug. And that's a big fear for a lot of people. There doesn't seem to be much substance to that in terms of evidence of that. So yeah, and in a sense we're trying to, and there was reference earlier to trying to, because the Private Purposes Act does allow for dealing, trade, buying and selling of cannabis if it's licensed in terms of some national legislation. We had been trying to get small business to provide for that in terms of the Business Act, but it would seem that's less likely to happen. But that's basically jumping already to the position that yes, trade in cannabis should be legalized in some form. But yeah, I think we've got, the way I would have put it in terms of the three areas, to my mind, the hemp sector is basically legal, but regulated. You've got to apply for a license from the Department of Agriculture, and in the Medicines Act, THC from a plant grown from a permit issued under the Plant Improvement Act, that THC is excluded from the Medicines Act if it's not being used for medicinal purposes. So that's largely free. Obviously, when it comes to exporting, the EU level is I think 0.3. We are, as Myrtle had said, I think the next highest country is 1%. So there may be problems that hemp growers may have if they're exporting hemp including the fruiting and flowering tops which would have the most of the concentrate of THC. Medicinal cannabis then is to some extent there in the more recent, 22C, which doesn't provide for cultivation explicitly. I think if I speak under correction, but it refers to manufacturing. And so health have then said, okay, growing it can be included under manufacturing. And therefore, you have then this system of SAPRA granting licenses under 22C for people to grow cannabis for medicinal purposes. You've got, as Rochelle had spoken about, the problem of it's very onerous, the requirements, but to some extent, it's also, I think, with a view looking at the export market and countries prepared to accept medicinal cannabis from South Africa that's grown in terms of a 22C license. I won't talk more about Section 21. We all know what the problems with that are, as Myrtle has said. The last area then is the recreational sector. And that's the one that the Prince judgment had the biggest impact on, allowing for private usage of cannabis. But it's a thing of how do we regulate it? How do we ensure that I mean, it is a bit of a Gareth, you've heard me say this before, so don't be surprised. The High Court, I mean, the Concord judgment is a bit irrational in terms of you can consume cannabis for your private use, but you can't buy it. And you're limited to growing it. So where are you meant to get it from? What happens if you can't grow it? But the court had expressly refused to decriminalize dealing, and that's something that they did address. My understanding is this position, this irrationality, as I put it, that we have here is similar to other countries in the world, that you can consume it in a coffee shop in the Netherlands, but it's actually not legal. So but we've got to look at how we regulate the recreational sector. We've also got the problem of the international drug treaties and the UN Narcotics, Bureau Committee, who are monitoring the implementation of those regulations and wanting to know from South Africa what is actually happening with decriminalizing of cannabis and there's discussions around how best to approach that. But yeah, and then obviously there's the issue of one wants to ensure that particularly the traditional growers of cannabis who've grown cannabis for millennia, centuries and generations, but particularly in the period when it was quite heavily restricted and who suffered from that they are able to benefit from decriminalization of cannabis. And then you've also obviously got the issue of there is money in it and having to ensure that there's proper regulation of the larger scale commercial actors to ensure that the market is opened up more. But anyway, let me, that was just a response. I don't know if any comments, questions from the audience or anyone wants to, okay. I don't know how to.
I think we can speak without.
Yeah, maybe it'll be easier. The previous panel didn't have mics, so yeah, go for it. But just speak up, Gareth, please. Yeah.
So a great concern amongst our community is that you are trying to reinvent the wheel and that there isn't really a need for this whole thing to be complicated because there's no normative difference between alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. So at the very least, the cannabis industry should enjoy the benefits that those two industries have. But by virtue of the fact that it's also the subject of a national master plan, it deserves more favorable treatment. And there is a matter of hypocrisy and legal absurdity when it comes to how we're going to regulate a substance that is customary and cultural within South Africa. So the whole notion around this being a part of drugs and criminality and danger and deviance, those are all lies to a great extent. And the uncomfortable truth is that government must accept that this is a very valuable natural resource that can assist them in fulfilling their promises to the people: food, clothes, shelter, health, education, and welfare. And it's also a substance that has the ability to improve the socio-economic conditions of especially the previously disadvantaged, and that a new social compact can be developed between government and its people in order to demonstrate how the people can work with their government in order to take us forward as a society as a whole. So the complication is really that government must get out of its own way, partner with its people in order to take this industry forward, because I'm still confident that we can develop a legislative blueprint within this country that can be the envy of the rest of the world and truly demonstrate how the people can work with their government in order to provide within the needs and the desires of all of us. Because we can't really blame those who have taken the opportunity of starting a grey industry as such, as the social clubs. But we cannot forget those who suffer as a result of being unlawfully criminalized because they chose to associate with their customary plant and to engage in conduct that wasn't illegal before the colonial advent and which was interrupted by brutality and slavery, and which now has the right to continue without, all of this black market and unregulated and all of these things being that it's labeled with. We need to free ourselves from that type of thinking and that type of labeling, and understand that this is one of South Africa's most valuable natural resources and that it can take us forward as a whole.
I very much agree with what Gareth has said, and Paul Michael, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think in Dennis Davis's original ruling, he actually made dealing in cannabis legal. And then when it got to Zondo in the Constitutional Court, he said, no, you can't actually answer that question because it's not something that's been asked. So you can't make a judgment on that because you're kind of straying outside of the boundaries. So the way it's been framed is almost like, bring us that question and we will answer it for you legally if you actually challenge the law. There's no law to challenge yet, so it's a bit of a weird situation. In South Africa, we tend to take laws and regulations as suggestions, which is why for the Zen guy over there, you understand how it works here. That's why we have, and I prefer to say a grey market, not a black market, in all of this stuff. If there was going to be a problem, we're 7 years into this. Say the judgment was 2018, the shops started popping up 2019, we're in 2026. We're 7 years into it. We've got thousands of stores. If something had actually gone wrong and people had been dying from it, or cannabis has been destroying lives or something, there would have been enough people making noise about it. None of that has happened. So we're actually in a model proving situation at the moment where we proved the model over the last 7 years that we can, number one, regulate ourselves if government don't actually get their act together. And number two, we can prove to everyone, as Gareth has said, that the regulations are really a bunch of rubbish because the world hasn't fallen apart. The sky hasn't come down on us. We've got thousands of these stores and nothing's actually happened yet. So we need to get to the point where we actually have some regulation that we can actually challenge in the courts with a number of different arguments, and one of them being, if you're allowed to do this, you've got to have the means to do it. It's like saying you're allowed to have a steel door on your house, okay? But you've got to do it yourself. You've got to go and find the steel, dig it out of the ground, process it, make the door, fit the door, everything yourself. You're not allowed to ask anyone to do it. Where if you prefer to use gummies, you are expected to grow your own weed, then process the gummies, put everything together, and use it yourself. You need specialized knowledge in order to do just about every one of those steps. So they're saying this is allowable to you, but we're going to tie your hands behind your back and not let you do anything. It's very irrational.
I think that Gareth made a particularly good point about the government standing in their own way. I don't know whether anybody has read I think it's 76 or 67 pages of the National Cannabis Master Plan. I could rewrite it in a few hours to be 10 pages. Why have we got a 67-page load of blah, blah master plan that also hasn't changed since 2021? Somebody sent it the other day and said, oh, look, we've got a master plan. I said, no, it's the same old thing that's been out forever. So I think this simplification and market research, I think that it's another thing that breaks my heart is that we don't have anybody from government here today.
Yeah.
You know, and Paul Michael always says, government's got a PR problem. Why aren't they here today? It's not as if they weren't invited. I know they were.
Okay, Paul Michael, and then at the back, right at the back, well, okay, but Paul?
Firstly, just to echo what Russ, it's okay, I think. To echo what Russ Gareth had to say, that government does have a tendency to stand on its own toes. But I don't fully agree with what you had to say. I mostly do, but not entirely. Just the one correction is that, and somebody is, I don't have the 2018 judgment in front of me. I don't believe that it was that the Constitutional Court said you didn't ask for dealing. It said that you haven't convinced us. That in terms of Section 36, they said that Section 36 was not discharged in that there are still legitimate state objectives that are served through the criminalisation of the dealing in of cannabis. Section 36 is a nice juncture to get into the rest of what you were proposing there. I don't believe that to say that the sky hasn't fallen is a legitimate justification for zero regulation or complete self-regulation. There are established harms that are associated with unregulated cannabis use. Children can get their hands on it. Somebody could get their hands on contaminated cannabis or cannabis that far exceeds the concentrations that the packaging says are there. So we do need some sort of minimum standards, regulated standards, fitness for human consumption, under what circumstances you must store this, keep it out of the hands of children, etc. But the reason that I mentioned Section 36, and it ties into what Gareth was saying, is that government does have a tendency to assume that every time it says that a legitimate state objective is being served, that's the end of the inquiry. It's actually quite a forensic inquiry. The intervention needs to match the problem. And if your intervention is actually doing more harm than it is preventing, you failed the Section 36 inquiry. So it's a balanced thing. But I don't think that an unregulated market is justifiable.
Sorry, I didn't mean unregulated.
But okay,
let's
just, we've got other people I don't want to debate. So at the back, Etienne, it was you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So just to add to the point on harms of cannabis and the evidence base available in South Africa at the moment. So we've got the South African Medical Research Council, right? They've got a unit that does epidemiological research on drugs.
So Etienne, can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, it's that touch as well. So the SAMRC is actively collecting data on drug epidemiology in South Africa, right? And I've been looking at the published results as they publish them year after year, and we've not seen an increase in cannabis-related substance use problems right now. I think there's also a bit of a skew there and a bit of a methodological problem in terms of looking at what the data actually says, because firstly we don't have a proper baseline to really evaluate it adequately, which again is fault of whoever hasn't been necessarily collected in the right way. But I think that the regulatory vacuum, standards vacuum, we hear reports of people getting cannabis that is bad in some way. It might be contaminated with either say mold or whatever, or there might be other contaminants in it, because again, cannabis is a hyperaccumulator, so things like arsenic, lead, whatever, it does pose a problem in terms of regulation and standards that are very much required. And because of the status of Mavericks taking this gap and developing the private sector for themselves. I'm curious to see the disaggregated data and the way that we categorize the collection of data as well, to see if there was a reduction, because there was also a lot of coercion before through deferment programs in through the criminal justice system, where you say, okay, if you're arrested for cannabis, it's not such a big deal. You go into rehab and you're off the hook, kind of thing, right? Now, I think what's happening there is likely, if we had the disaggregated data to go and look at it, that because we're not seeing so many arrests, there's been a reduction in people being admitted to rehabilitation centers, but there might also be uptaking people that legitimately have, health events because of bad, or contaminated cannabis, and that's why we see that even kill statistic where it doesn't show that there's really been an increase of harms related to cannabis, which I don't think is necessarily all true again, but just taking it at face value, I would argue that, again, we have the capacity, we have the incentive to collect that data, and if we look at it more closely, we might actually be able to create a convincing evidence-based argument that the harms from cannabis are not what they've been made out to be, and using that we can collect more accurate data and actually fill that picture in better to create better public health interventions. So it's more of a they're just adding to the conversation than asking a question.
Okay, thanks, Etienne. It's the gentleman there, yeah, but just Rochelle wanted to respond, but I'll then give you and the lady at the back there.
Okay, just to add on to what he has just said, I think the inaccuracy when it comes to data calls for the need for regulations, because already if we are not aggregating correct data at the moment, that means we are leaving behind possible effects from the use of cannabis based off where it's being bought or the distribution channels. So I believe the regulations will put strict requirements for quality assurance when it comes to the plant to the product itself that ends within the hands of the consumer. It also creates a broad way of protecting the market, especially for kids. I think we are speaking from a point of privilege, if I have to say. There are specific communities whereby kids are exposed to cannabis. They can get it off the streets from black market sellers. So I think it's quite important that the government brings out regulations which are simplified. Everybody can get to understand, and within that, the government engages with us more, not only us as the stakeholder within the regulatory world, but also everybody within the cannabis space. Because at the end of the day, us not being able to collect data, it means that we can say nothing has changed, but something is changing. We actually do not know the effects that are out in the country. So it's quite important that we try to at least push for regulations, as much as it could possibly take a long time to get those regulations. But regulations, they become very important in trying to protect the market and protect the population in the country.
Okay, thanks, gentleman over there. By the way, we've got 4 minutes technically. It's lunch, so hopefully they won't enforce it too much. But I've got 2 hands, so if you can both try and be brief, thanks.
I'll be brief and try to just ask some pointed questions, whether you kind of guys have any indication that, for example, the term hemp, whether we're actually going to liberate the plant from colonial categories, and we can celebrate 2%, but if we're still calling it hemp, are the conversations in government that we're going to actually do away with these in the future and have end regulation use, for example, or that, it's not a new argument. We've been making it for years that the Medicines Act speaks nowhere of cultivation, and that's where the problem, I think, primarily from a legal perspective, when you talk about the white elephant of Section 21, comes in. If you're allowing SARPA to regulate the plant in the ground, well, then you're going to have this problem of Section 2. So are there, in the Pakistan in 23, we heard that there were very kind of progressive debates around doing away with this strict hemp versus cannabis thing. We're still allowing ourselves to be defined by the colonial categories, and we're trying to celebrate within those confines these victories, which are victories, but are there, just basically to ask the question, are these conversations being actively pursued in government, and do we expect any differences going forward? Are we just going to continue on these kind of relative victories, but within these like lockages of the categories that exist and have been inherited from the outside?
Yeah, just a quick response on that. That is one of the questions as far as the overarching legislation aspect. How should things be defined? We've got, in a sense, a little bit of a contradiction in that the Private Purposes Act doesn't talk about hemp, it just talks about cannabis, and it defines cannabis as only the fruiting or flowering tops of the plant, nothing else, excluding the seed, etc. I think to try and free up the hemp sector, that's why agriculture put in that definition of hemp. It comes from Department of Agriculture in terms of their regulations. But the question of how one defines hemp and cannabis, and do you have THC levels or other cannabinoids? Do you have end use as you're raising? Those are issues that are on the table for discussion. Can I have the person there?
Yes, good morning, thank you. I just wanted to preface what I wanted to say from what Myrtle quoted a couple of years ago at a pharmacy conference, and said, be careful what you wish for. So we sort of got what we wanted, and
We're not, well, maybe, yeah.
Sorry, I don't know, not loud enough. Morning, everyone. My name's Jackie. So, preface what Myrtle said is a couple of years ago at be careful what you wish for at a conference, because we got what we wished for in decriminalization, but regulation. So, technically speaking, we have the regulations. Medicines and Related Substances Act and the Pharmacy Act state that Section 22, we can cultivate and we can create a good manufacturing practice facility. Section 21 has been completely misinterpreted, and that's why everybody's got such gone up in arms. But technically, it's not complicated. Section 21 is for a product that is not registered in the country, and you import it from another country. Okay, we don't have a registered cannabis product in South Africa, so technically we can import a product. But importing flower and putting it into a joint is not a product, because a joint is not a pharmaceutical dosage form. And I know I'm gonna ruffle some feathers or raise some eyes, and I get it. I'm here because I'm a full supporter of the cannabis plant across the board. I've been in the business, much to lots of collateral damage over the last 7 or 8 years, and I think lots of us can experience that in different ways. But I'm saying it as a strong point, is that a joint is not a pharmaceutical dosage form. So put it in an elixir or put it in a tincture or whatever the case may be, but the laws are there. Why are we circumventing them in every single possible way? And we've said why we do, because regulations are interpretable and we can move the boundaries. But I think we really need to be clear, and there's a lot of misalignment in communication in the stakeholders, but the regulations are there, that everybody just needs to speak to each other. SAPs are undercapacitated, but they can't down to the level of the police, who are supposed to be going to check the licenses at the stores, are under-resourced and undercapacitated. And SAPRA certainly is, to a certain extent. They only have 7 sets of inspectors for the whole of the country, for cannabis, non-cannabis, and medical device institutions that they need to inspect. So I don't know, I'm not asking a question, I'm maybe asking just for comment and just stating some facts.
You were giving a comment. Shad?
I'd like to maybe approach it from a different side of things as well, which is to look at on the supply side. I mean, and also the distinction of products that we have in cannabis. We often refer to, the medical side of cannabis as being, well, you can look at the different products, like oils and vapes and gummies and then you've got flour. I mean, you can't actually process these things in a private cloud format safely without, you need a large-scale processing equipment. I mean, sometimes you need heavy chemicals to get to the level of price competitiveness that you see in the market. So we have, if you've got the GMP guidelines, and under Annexure 6 of those guidelines, it allows for GACP product to be purchased, and that GACP product isn't necessarily a GMP facility. So now you can incorporate small-scale cultivators and outdoor cultivators and all of that, not to produce medical products, but to produce the raw materials that feed into those products. Why are we avoiding that route? And why then you look at GMP itself, there are strict guidelines in place for very, very clear reasons. It's public safety. The products that we see in many of these cannabis dispensaries, which I believe is the future of the industry, extracts and concentrates, and they are actually capable of being dosed by a doctor. Instead of saying to a doctor to say, hey, smoke 2 of these pre-rolls, I mean, it's almost nonsensical. So now you've got all of these processed products, and we see them proliferating throughout the market. The kids are all smoking, and a lot of the dangers that we often say about cannabis are coming from these products. Why are we not giving access to people to access those locally, instead of going around an uncertain product like flour, for instance, where you've got varying levels of contaminants and THC, and it's a live product that changes based on time, based on how it's treated and stored, and there's all these things behind it. Section 21, for instance, as much.
Sean, sorry, can you wrap up, because I've got a few other hands and I wanted to give everyone on the panel a chance to have a final word.
My question and point is simply, why not use the tools that we have to achieve the objectives that we are trying to achieve?
Can you just pass the mic to Jan? Yeah. So I've got you and then the person on the other side of Ras Prince and Ush. One over there, and no, you're not. Okay, so it's just going to be those 3 hands, and then we will close.
Is it not time that we moved away from what people like Jim had, because it isn't a plant, it's a name? We have industrial cannabis in South Africa. The Eastern Cape produces more industrial cannabis than the whole of Europe. Why is that industry not being legitimized? Why is it not being given an opportunity to pull people out of poverty? Why are we still so stuck on THC, when clearly it is sold on every corner around this country freely? Is it not time that the government actually legalize the plant so that the people can move forward?
Okay, next.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for that one, Neil. I'm missing something very, I think, integral to the discussion. And I just kind of want to raise it for the benefit of the audience. You know, we have a document, I think, that overarches not only South African legislation, but international cannabis policy, treaties, etc., etc. The current disparity between the existing Section 22 model is hitting a brick wall when it comes to the UNDRIP document, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know, but that's not the only document I think that is relevant for us to focus on. Why I say that is because in South Africa, the nature of our legislative landscape is there's the democratic landscape, and then there's the landscape of the indigenous peoples. And then we're hitting this conflict now where we as indigenous peoples are faced with having to refer to this document and the specifics within this document, you know. And I just want to highlight a few things. There's the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Convention on the Right of the Child. You know, you're looking at a population of 370 million indigenous peoples in 70 countries around the world. You know, cannabis now being post-COVID a known serious, I think, offset to the pharmaceutical over-the-counter medication. Dictates, I think, it's happening within our government. You know, that puts into direct conflict a piece of legislation called the Traditional Health Practitioner Act, you know, that gives us the perfect framework in order for us to agitate the self-governance and the customizing of this model, you know, because you're dealing with the fact we as a country legislatively, like Jackie is referring to there, through the Pharmacy Act, that is the basis of the law of incrimination for any traditional health practitioner. That was the first piece of legislation, not the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act, but I'm speaking in layman's terms. So why are we not working with the indigenous peoples within the, the Congress of Traditional Leaders? You know, why are we not safeguarding ourselves to not create this conflict within law? Because indigenous peoples out there see this as an indigenous medicine. It's an indigenous plant. And so I reference to the industrial side of it. falls within these ambits. You know, you're blocking the ability for international law says the peoples have the right to self-determination. So where are we going to get to that point in this discussion where we address the UNDRIP and the responsibility to that? Oh.
Okay, can I, yeah, just one more, I know you're...
Hello, I'm Dr. Siebu Prosper from Zambia, Cannabis Board Chairperson. I know we're talking about the South African challenges, and I just want to highlight our part. We had the Section 21 in what we call the Dangerous Drugs Act, where us as doctors can then recommend to a patient, and the patient can import cannabis and cannabis products. So what we did as a solution for our country is we repealed our laws, and we have what we call the Controlled Substance Act. What does it mean? Myself and my colleagues can prescribe cannabis for patients. And we wrote what we call the Cannabis Act, a separate act, and we also wrote what we call the Industrial Hemp Act. So what does it mean? As a Schedule I drug, cannabis, we as medical practitioners can prescribe, and we are able to engage insurance to pay for cannabis and cannabis products in Zambia. So I just wanted to add that in terms of this is a policy conference, and to see how other countries are going around the challenges you are having for cannabis. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I had wanted to give the panel the opportunity to, but are you going to allow me, or you're running for time?
Well, yeah, because I'm mindful of everyone being back for 1:30 for the next panel, so we don't cut down in there.
Okay, well look, this was this was an hour's discussion. I don't think we were intended to come with any conclusions. We're here for three days, so I think the debates will continue. So I'd like to thank the panel. Sorry you didn't get more of an opportunity to speak. Thank you to the audience for your participation. Let the debates and the discussion continue. Thanks.